In this overview, we're going to spend a few minutes talking about our portrait project. This is quite an in-depth project and is covered over the next 8 tutorials, actually working in Aspire, then a final tutorial to summarize and talk about some special cases that you may have to deal with when creating a portrait. Here I'm just going to overview the tutorials and talk a bit more about some of the things to be aware of when doing this type of job. We're looking here really at modeling portraits from a photo or a painting. Whether you're doing either of those, you use the same process for both types of image. It is time consuming and it can be reasonably difficult, but it is not impossible, and hopefully we'll show you that over these tutorials. For good results, it's very important that you have a good quality image. That's the number one thing that you're going to need. It needs to be focused on the subject, so the face of your subject needs to be prominent within the image. If you're pulling things off the internet, or if you've been given a digital photograph and the person or animal that you're trying to model is not very much the majority of the image that you have, then it's probably not going to work. You're going to need to create lots of vectors, which we'll cover in the tutorial. You're going to need to be somewhat competent with the interactive sculpting. If you've never used the sculpting, this is probably not a good project. Certainly you'll get a lot of practice by the end of it, but it's going to help if you're already somewhat familiar with the sculpting, and then doing projects like this is really going to start to hone your skills. Ultimately as well, in order to get through a process like this, because of how time consuming it can be, you're going to need patience, time and motivation. That motivation may be a client paying you to do this, or it may be motivation to do something for a friend or family member, or even for something like a memorial, in which case this can be a terrifically rewarding project to do. For our project, we're going to look at an image of a portrait of George Washington. It's a good strong subject. Obviously it's very iconic. We tried to pick something that people would be familiar with. It's a great pose, and it's also a reasonable quality image. I was able to manually crop this down so that I had the face as the key area within my photograph, and that's still 800 by 1000 pixels, which I think is reasonable to pull a half decent texture from. The resolution is important, and if you have a modern digital photograph where it's in focus and where the person is the primary subject in the photo, then that's probably going to be an excellent starting point. The process that we're going to overview here and go through in the tutorials: first, we're going to import, size and position the file. We're going to generate a test component from the image, which I'll discuss in a moment. We're going to create very detailed vector outlines, build up the basic shapes for each sub-assembly, and by sub-assembly I mean things like the face or the nose or the eyes. We're going to then work on the Z position of those, the tilt and the fade, and adjust those and do sculpting for each of those layers, each of those components. Then we're going to do a second round of sculpting where we join those pieces together, sculpt them together, and then ultimately add a lot of detail by creating or sculpting the texture that we generated from the image and adding the two together. Finally, you would go ahead and do what I call finesse sculpting, which is where you really try and fix any small problems that you have, or add any sort of extra detail that you need to really bring out the personality of the person. A lot of the success of this project can be linked to how you set up the file, and because that's going to dictate the way the vectors are created, the way the components are created, and really how everything's going to come together when you get to the end. So what I think you need to do is think about the layers and assemblies that you're going to build during this, both as vectors and components. These are the typical ones that I would use in most projects where I'm doing a portrait of a person. First, the basic face shapes, which is the underlying roundness of the face, forehead, cheeks and lower jaw. These are the big shapes that make up the most of the mass of somebody's head. Next are the detailed face shapes that sit on top of that, and these will be things like the cheeks and jowls, the chin, the brows, the forehead, and this is really where you've got the sort of muscular type shapes that are sitting on top of your skull, if you like. Next, I would do a separate layer and component for each of the features that you have, such as eyes, nose, mouth, teeth, facial hair and ears. The hair outline needs to be created, And then any man-made objects you may have, like clothes, glasses, a monocle, or anything else, jewellery, something like that, they would need to be dealt with separately. Finally, it's important to have an overall silhouette layer, and that's going to help you when you come, if you need to start cropping things back to the original. Some tips and tricks that will be helpful to you in this process. When you've got an image, if you're not sure if it's suitable or if it's going to work well, the best thing to do is to load it and just quickly see if you can create a component from that image and how that looks. You may need to smooth it a little and adjust the height of it to just check what sort of quality you can get from the image you've got. Secondly, zoom in and take a look at the detail in the image to make sure that you can see it clearly enough to draw vectors over it. In this case, I zoomed in close on the face and made sure I could see the details around the eye and the nose and the mouth and the different areas as they related to each other to make sure I'd be able to draw these vectors clearly. While you're working on a project like this, it's imperative that you have a copy of it that you can constantly refer to. So that would either be on a second monitor where you can always see it, or if you don't have that, then you would need to print it out, ideally in color if it was a color image, and use that and sit it on your desk and have that as a reference constantly that you can look at. This means that you're not going to miss anything out. It'll make sure that you can see everything that's going to go into the part all the time, even if you're only working on a small part of it. The other important thing is that this will let you create what you actually see, not what you imagine. We're so used to looking at people and faces that our brains fill in a lot of details, and sometimes they fill in things which are not actually there in terms of how we interpret the shape of something, like for instance how round our lips are or something like that. So by looking at the image and keeping looking at the image, it can be very helpful to you in order to see that you make not assuming things rather than creating the stuff that's actually there. You need to analyze the types of shapes that you have, whether they're a soft transition like we have in the cheek here, or whether it's a harder edge like we have in this part of the jowl or under the bottom or edge of the nose. You need to think about the relative depths. With that in mind though, you have to remember we're not trying to model the statue of a person that is an actual replica. We're trying to model a low relief object. So that means that relative depths are the nose and the forehead and the cheek may all end up at the same depth, but at the points where they overlap, we need to make sure that whatever prominent is sitting up higher. The tutorials themselves will cover a number of different things. The first tutorial is going to cover the vectors. We're going to load and position the model, create a layer for appropriate features as we work our way through, and very carefully draw the vectors over the image, as you can see on the image on the screen. We're going to repeat that for each layer and sub-assembly that I discussed just now. The final vector layout should look something like the image you can see here. In this tutorial, we're only going to cover an overview of the vector creation, and a reason for that is it's quite a time-consuming process. You can see how complex these vectors are, and certainly this may take you several hours to draw all the vectors you need. So we're really just going to give you a guide as to how you would do this, and so that you'll then be able to go away and whatever your subject is, or if you're following along with this, you'll be able to create the vectors or move along to that next stage. Tutorials 2 and 3 will cover the creation of the basic shapes. We're going to work through, create the basic shapes for each layer and sub-assembly. So for the nose, the face shapes, the detail face shapes, the base face shapes for the clothes. The only thing we're aiming to do at this point in time is get the rough shapes and depth correct. I'm not worried about the fact that these are overlapping oddly and that maybe I don't have the correct combine mode, or maybe they're not in a good order in the list. I'm mainly just trying to create some basic shapes to work from. In tutorials 4 and 5, we're going to do what I would call the edits. This is where we're still working with individual components. We're going to start working through those layers and those components. We're going to smooth and smudge the shapes on there to start to create the blends that we need. We're also going to start to be concerned at this point in time about the depth of the files as they are to each other, the tilt and the fade relationships to make sure that they're correct with the parts that overlap with the components that we're working on, and also the combine mode in the component list and the order in the list to make sure that things are appearing or are prominent over or under other items in the list. We're going to also start to do things like punch out holes for the eyes and create eyeballs, and also we're going to create a copy of the face shapes in order to use a base for the hair. And this is a very important technique which is going to help you to get it so that the hair is sticking out above this side of the head but sitting down behind this side of the head. That'll be covered in these tutorials. Tutorial 6 and 7 are going to cover more in-depth sculpting. This is where we're going to start to actually bring the components together. We're going to group everything we've got, we're going to create a duplicate of the group and bake it, then we're going to sculpt the shapes together to make the finished base model. So this is essentially all the standard shapes we've got finished off, blended together, smoothed and sculpted so that they start to interact with each other, but it still hasn't got the detail from the image. The next stage in this is to create the detail from the image, so I switch on the texture component or create the texture component from the image and adjust the depth, the smoothness, and spend a lot of time sculpting to add extra detail in, for instance to make sure we've got everything we need for the hair, we smooth off any of the texture we don't want and make sure we've got whatever shape we want for the cloak and for the front part of the shirt here. We then add those two together and that will give us the result that you can see on the screen. Then finally in tutorial 8 we're going to do finesse sculpting. This is where we take that combined model. Again, I would make a duplicate to keep a safe copy. I'm going to carefully compare that with the original image. Of course I've been doing that all the time, but now I have to get extremely critical about small details and start to make adjustments that we need. Typically that will mostly be sculpting, but sometimes you might have to make a significant change, like in this case you can see that we took the eyes that were quite sunken and made them less so, and I didn't do that with the sculpting, I actually did that by modeling some shapes, and we'll show you that technique during the tutorials in this particular section on finesse sculpting. At this stage what you're really trying to capture is what makes the person that particular person, and so it's very important to be aware of the small details and to be extremely critical of what you've created and how closely it represents the image. What I would say is that before you get to this stage it can be very helpful to leave the model alone and come back to it at another time, because if you've spent a long time working on something you can have got to the point where your eyes can't very easily see small problems with it because you've started to fill in the details automatically. So if you leave it overnight, come back to it the next day or have somebody else take a look at it for you, they might be able to pick things out which are not quite right that you can change if you want to. So to finish this section I thought I'd show you a few parts that were created by some customers, Bill LeBader and Don Gilmore. These were all done with the George Washington model that we're going to create in the tutorials, and you can see that we have a representation carved into wood and stained. We have one which has been pressed into copper sheet, and here's a very interesting example that's been cast into a piece of glass. So you can see once you've got a model like this, it's tremendously flexible what you can do with it. In our example we won't be covering the creation of toolpaths, but you should see that this is a pretty standard 3D model, and once you've finished it, it can very easily be toolpathed in the same way as anything else, or it can even be used as in a component in a more complex design like Bill and Don have here by adding the flourishes. So that concludes this summary of this project, and the next tutorial that follows on from this will be the creation of the vectors for our George Washington model.